Hi, everyone. Happy Thursday. I hope you're all staying safe and healthy. I'm Elizabeth, the product owner for training and new content at the Scrum at Scale LLC, and I'd like to welcome you today to today's webinar with Euvin Naidoo. We are delighted to have Euvin with us for the next hour, speaking in his personal capacity to exchange ideas and engage us as a community. Forbes.com has named him as one of the most powerful and influential men of his generation in Africa, and Columbia University's Journal of International Affairs has named him as one of the 5 faces of African innovation. He is a young global leader alumnus at the World Economic Forum, having served 2 terms on the United States Global Agenda Council focused on unpacking strategies for the ideals of democracy as well as innovation and entrepreneurship. And now, based out of Boston, in January this year, he co-led Harvard Business School's first short intensive program on scaling agility. His new article, 7 Successful Military Strategies to Beat COVID-19, was just released Tuesday, where it was featured as the lead article on Harvard Business Working Knowledge. Also with us is Carol McEwen, our CEO, who will be facilitating with him. And before handing it off to Euvin and Carol, I'd like to cover just a few housekeeping items. First, to provide you with the best listening experience, all audio lines except the host and presenters will be muted. We will not be utilizing the raise a hand functionality. So please, if you'd like to ask a question, use the Q&A panel on your console. All right, with that, I'd like to hand it over to Euvin and Carol. Take it away.
Great, thanks so much, Beth. We are very, very excited to have Euvin with us today. And I'd just like to let everybody know that the format that we'll be using is Euvin will share with you his findings and knowledge for about the first 30 to 35 minutes. And then we'll have some time for discussion and Q&A. So be sure to get those questions and their questions into the Q&A panel, and we'll be taking a look at them. Of course, you know, we probably won't be able to get to all of them because an hour just isn't enough time, but we're excited to share as much as we can with you today. So we are very, very humbled to have Euvin Naidoo with us. And Euvin, thank you for choosing to share your knowledge with us today. Take it away.
It's a great pleasure to be here, Carol. Thank you so much to the Scrum at Scale team and the Agile community for this invitation. And I just wanted to say, I wish everybody good health and safety, you know, all across the world. We have a number of colleagues that have indicated they will be dialing in. It's great to be here in my personal capacity, you know, to share thoughts on this subject, very prescient, timely subject of agility, and what does that mean in today's so-called VUCA world: volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. Because there's no doubt that we are in a what we call a crucible moment of leadership. Certainly in this generation that are leading the workforce, this may be possibly their defining moment, you know, in our lifetimes. A particular moment where all across the globe are facing similar challenges: disruption in our personal lives, in the lives of our children, our organizations, our countries, supply chains, across shopping channels, unprecedented. Earlier this week, the head of Harvard Business School's finance unit hosted Larry Summers, and Professor Summers, one of the great thinkers and academics, and also Treasury Secretary, shared his view on why this is a so-called crucible moment. He described it as follows. He said, if the 2008 financial crisis was the Rockies, this is the Himalayas. In his experience, unprecedented. In fact, he called it a Pearl Harbor moment to explain the gravity. And it's particularly in moments like this that leadership is defined. And why, Carol and I were so looking forward to this is that in our discussions, the focus on agility has come to the fore as an approach in which to deal with the deluge of challenges that are taking place, real tools that can help people face these so-called leadership moments. Another colleague put it as follows, is this one of the moments that we are going to step into the challenge or step away? And yes, it's a leadership moment, but a lot of it is about the tools and the thinking. So let's get into it, because this is the image I thought I would share in terms of what comes to mind, that many of us are facing what we think is an insurmountable force that is flowing towards us. And in fact, the way to look at it is that the world seems to have become suddenly agile. And we'll get into what does that mean to be suddenly agile. Teams are distributed, particularly from the corporate world. And a lot of what I'll be sharing from a personal perspective is drawing from experience in the business school, but also from experience as a consultant and someone as a banker from financial services, that experience in corporations, and also as an experience from an entrepreneurial perspective, that in facing the so-called suddenly agile world, you have to think in smaller increments. You have to respond in real time to what we call the unknown unknowns. In traditional strategy, many organizations have teams, many leaders, even entrepreneurs, are very comfortable in the so-called known world, the regular rhythm. And in many cases, you can plan for the known unknowns. You know what is going to be coming down the path, and there's a plan, towards that. A sudden urgent customer order is a known unknown that may come. But in this new era of unknown unknowns, rapid changes, unexpected businesses, be it your staff, be it your supply chain, your partners, it's very important on thinking through how do you deal with this. Because a lot of it goes back to this graphic, which is not just about facing the waterfall, but within the agile world, what we call waterfall thinking. And this move from waterfall thinking to agile thinking was one of the big themes that formed the basis of the January short intensive program. I was very fortunate to co-lead with colleagues and had tremendous support to put that together. Where we got together a group of leaders, some of the leading thinkers across the world, to start thinking through this context of this world we are in which, under the so-called normal circumstances, pre-COVID-19, many of us, many organizations were facing an atmosphere of new competitors entering the space, customers that are expecting more from organizations. If you were in government, citizens expecting more. Call it increased connectivity, increased bandwidth, the power of social media. But the level of awareness across the ecosystem had reached a point where organizations were finding more and more that the traditional ways of communicating were a struggle. Little did we realize in January that all of those processes of being able to respond faster in an iterative manner, in a structured manner, to be able to develop the DNA and the muscle memory was actually, if you could summarize it, a boot camp for crisis management and exactly what we are facing. Make no mistake, few were prepared. And in fact, I would say if anyone says that they were fully prepared for what was coming, I would say that would be an absolute minority. But by and large, even the most agile of organizations have faced extreme challenge. The difference is the ability, the muscle memory to be able to respond. And I think the first element in this, in all of this, are the themes of humility, that we're all learning from one another. Second is that no one has the absolute answers. In this experimentation, in this learning how to go about developing responses, I think that approach becomes very important. And that's the beauty of what we'll start unpacking in the so-called agile approach, is that built into it is this servant leadership of learning, understanding, failing fast, not being able to be afraid of picking up. The challenge we face, of course, in COVID-19 is that some of these decisions are so critical that we have to do that at the same time. One commentator mentioned that in times like this, if your roof was already leaking, be it a company, organization, or country, where you had structural changes, it's really tough to be in this hurricane at this moment. But this isn't going to be one of these sessions where we're like, well, for those of us that have been building up this muscle memory, good for you. Really want to have a conversation. Carol and I have had this discussion of dealing with people who are at various phases of this transition or development. There are some today for which this concept agile, which is one of the most loosely thrown words, and we'll unpack it, is brand new. What does that actually mean? Others have started the process and have done pieces of it. It may be frustrating because this is a very challenging system to implement. If you have a culture that is hierarchical, to move to an agile system, particularly in this moment in time, it can be challenging at the best of times. In these times, it must be incredibly challenging. And certainly for those that have built in agile teams, call them scrum teams or whatever language we want to use, teams that are used to being distributed, that are working in smaller groups, that are focused on an iterative feedback loop, it is still challenging. And so the first thing is, I'm delighted to share ideas. I'm looking forward to also learning from you through the Q&A. And a lot of what I'm going to share is really built on the shoulders of an incredible agile community. And I want to emphasize that particularly in this moment, it is this community that I hope is really supporting and living up to the values of the servant leadership that takes place and is a foundational principle. So this image of facing the waterfall, but also breaking the so-called waterfall thinking is one I wanted to start with. Now, the thinking from waterfall to pitfalls to the so-called windfall of the benefits of moving into this agile world and what it means is part and parcel. Is that the mindset that many are in at this moment of saying, how do you survive, the challenges that we are facing, to a mindset of how do you thrive is going to be part of what I'm going to talk about. I want to get into where does this agile movement come from? What does it mean? And there's a lot of literature on this. No session will cover all elements, and I hope this will lead to more questions to folks going online. And there's some fantastic articles on the origins of agile, but a particular moment that's quite important in the agile world is 2001 and the so-called Agile Manifesto that came together with a group of leaders, luminaries of their time within software, came together in Snowbird, Utah, and came up with the 4 principles of the so-called Agile Manifesto. Now, the roots and DNA is much of debate, but in them you will find elements of lean management, to those that are familiar with the Toyota production system, which at its heart is about eliminating waste. But more than that, it's also a very humanistic approach. It is about a deep respect for individuals and recognizing that people are behind companies and organizations. Very much like what we're facing in this crisis, that behind all the systems and management talk, at the end of the day, this is a human crisis. And so back in Snowbird, Utah, the 4 principles that came out were, number 1, individuals and interactions over processes and tools. And the context was software development. How could software development be accelerated so that it really delivers to the customer for an incredible user experience? So individuals over interactions, processes, and tools. Working software over comprehensive documentation. And many of us are aware of, stacks and reams of documentation sometimes in a project. So this was to cut through that. Customer collaboration over contract negotiation. And finally, very important, responding to change over following a plan. And this is a theme we will constantly come back to. In our Agile Short Immersion program, in my personal work, engaging boards and leaders in organizations, helping them overcome the so-called inertia to delivering on projects, this responding to change over following a plan is very important. And so right at the bottom, you'll see, while there's value in the items on the bottom, we really value the items on the top more. This is what the authors, the creators of the Agile Manifesto meant. Now, one of the criticisms is that, was this just for software? And a big theme that emerged in January and all of the work that we're following and the work of others around the world is that Agile is not just for software. It applies to products, it applies to services. And so here, if we strike out software and put in products and services, individuals and interactions over processes, working product and services over comprehensive documentation, customer collaboration over contract negotiation, responding to change over following a plan, it suddenly becomes applicable. It becomes applicable to our entrepreneurial startup. It becomes applicable to our small and medium enterprise, customer collaboration, responding to change, working product and services that are being delivered. It applies to large corporations. One of the classic cases in the Agile world is the case of ING Bank, one of the first, and their leadership that said, when you receive that large documentation, when you either take out a home loan or car loan or a credit card, the CEO famously said, who here has actually read that documentation, right? How can we make it simple less than a page, less than 2 pages, that we understand it as human beings and our customers understand it. So that working product over comprehensive documentation, this kind of common sense, customer-centric approach is built into the DNA of this. And so in January, part of it was, how do you de-layer organizations? One of the big misconceptions within Agile implementation is that it becomes a free-for-all. Quite the contrary. Successful Agile frameworks are light frameworks that provide structure, that allow you to build the right mindset and culture, which is very important. But at the end of the day, it allows the so-called freedom. So Southwest Airlines, in one of the toughest sectors, probably facing the brunt, together with the healthcare sector, of what's taking the hospitality sector, the restaurant sector. One commentator on Bloomberg mentioned that Southwest Airlines may be one of the airlines best positioned to recover. And why is that the case? Because from an early stage, Southwest built in a philosophy that really touches along each of these elements. Staff members are empowered right at the coalface without having to turn to supervisors or layers with the discretionary budget to solve problems for customers that come in, a missing seat, a rush, and they're able to give that budget to really help create that customer experience. That empowerment, that ability for them to unlock agility at the coalface is built into the DNA of some organizations. And so many believe that that is part of an advantage. And so in summary, these are some of the themes in the work, that the traditional approach to management, and again, these are generalizations, is that there's a long time to market and failure avoidance in many organizations, right? That move from the top traditional approach to rapid adaptation, learning, and failure recovery. Many traditional organizations, not all, there are silos and fiefdoms that move to focus cross-functional, integrated teams. Layers of hierarchical improvement of approval, death by committee, very common practice, to small, empowered, focused teams on customers. Positive spin on progress because of the so-called politics in organizations, to an absolute transparent view of working versions. And there are many leaders that have elements of this. Ray Dalio with radical transparency for his hedge fund, and many other leaders believe in this. Jeff Bezos, for example, in terms of him having a seat, an empty seat for the customer at every meeting, where if there's a decision or a conflict, the turn to that empty seat to say, what would the customer, the so-called invisible customer that's present, actually say to remove that positive spin? And finally, the control and power to trust and coaching. And so the Agile community has been focused in many ways of learning and understanding the really difficult task of the right context. Okay, not every context, but the right context of where can this be applied to reduce the so-called decision period or feedback loop. In fact, it's kind of, if you were in a submarine, it's the sonar that goes out to the outside world and comes back in to get that feedback of, are we really satisfying customers? And the Agile world aims to do this. There are other movements that also focus on this and other management techniques, but certainly within this, there's a set of principles that say, how do we go about helping folks do that? And so, of course, Elon Musk's quote, it's important to have a feedback loop where you're constantly thinking about what you've done and how you can do that better. And so as we move out of the software world to the world of telcos, we've been engaged in exploring one of the successful telcos in the world that came from a hierarchical organization. Often the first step is to really start with the so-called agile mindset, that it's the mindset of the leadership of the teams of getting into this, of trying to delayer and increasing the feedback loop, and then moving into some of the organizational designs. So in the telco industry, in the banking industry, in oil and gas, in manufacturing, in the retail industry. In many ways, if one looks at what's been going on in the market and look at companies that are able to respond better, regardless of the sector, regardless of where we are, be it in government, be it in community organizations, that ability to have that feedback from the field and from staff, that connection of shortening that response time is very important. And certainly all of us can draw on the many decades of what the Agile community has been doing to see, can this be of value? Can we all learn from that? Can we take what many of us are already doing and draw on this, and in the spirit of getting it right, to better serve our communities, to better be able to respond. Part of that is that Agile is not a goal in itself, this loosely thrown word, right? To become better, faster, or stronger. On the customer side, it's to respond better to the customer, substitute citizen requirements or needs. For a shareholder, increase efficiency by breaking down silos, being able to really unlock what we call the true nature of what is in the organization, either the knowledge, the innovation, the inspiration that is there across teams. And lastly, with employees, increasing that engagement, retaining talent, bringing on talent. But Agile is not a goal in itself, it's a means to an end. And today, in particular, delighted to be here with the Scrum at Scale team, but our lot of discussion is going to be that it's not about a particular approach, it's about these principles, right? This agnostic approach. And that's part of what we did in January, and part of my work and my research is what are these principles that we can draw upon. As we move along, there is a lot of confusion sometimes in the discussion. And from my experience, I wanted to just share perspective on this world of strategic agility, operational agility, and cognitive agility. And what does this mean? And to remove jargon, remove words. But at a high level, strategic agility is this approach that it really is about a mindset, right? The mindset of getting closer to customers, alignment of unlocking the true value of our staff, of the people that are getting the job done, but making sure that strategically you are pointing the rocket ship in the right direction. So for example, you could have had an incredibly agile team that was delivering at an incremental basis at a Nokia or a Polaroid. But because the strategy was not in the right direction, you can operationally drive yourself with hyper efficiency off a cliff. And this is very important, particularly in crises, coming back to COVID-19. There can be very efficient operations in terms of getting things done. For example, we have incredible people around the world getting into the value chain of building various points of equipment, but making sure that strategically that is connected becomes important. And so strategic agility is about making sure the mindset is right of the leadership, of understanding the message that is constantly being done, and also the nimbleness of the organization of constantly evaluating the direction. Tied with operational agility, which is a lot of what we'll be talking about in the Scrum at Scale framework and other scaling frameworks of how do you get it done and implement it with some of those learnings, the small, the distributed team. But finally, cognitive agility, and you can substitute other words, but for that, it's really where it comes together. That ability to move between strategic and operational agility. And that is the nature of what's needed in this crisis. Leaders that are able to get the strategic part, operationalize it, and have that cognitive agility, which is really that ability to switch between the two. Built into that is a deep appreciation of risk. How does risk come into this element of understanding it? At the end of the day, agile practice in all its form of working on systems to reduce the feedback loop is really about a reduction in risk, a reduction in you making the right decisions, or in this world, the best informed decisions with little and sometimes very limited information to make sure that the rocket is pointed in the best possible direction and that you're able to adjust. And that is the leadership. And so on a personal capacity, to be part of an incredible faculty team that I learn from every day, is that part of that job is to really go through the cycle to train the general managers, the general management approach of broad knowledge, but deep knowledge of getting into strategy, getting into the operational elements, getting into this cognitive ability to switch between it. And ultimately, what are the lessons we can draw from, in the right context, the Agile community to make this work? Carol mentioned by coincidence, a piece I was very excited and honored to put together to share some of the thinking in this particular time where a lot of the talk is about war. You know, what is this that we are fighting? A battle. This is literally a war. Some have referred to it as a, World War III of all of humanity against this common invisible foe. And this article on the Harvard Business School Working Knowledge earlier this week, it was the lead article on 7 successful battle strategies to beat COVID-19, winning the war against COVID-19. And really in this, summarizing some of these elements. And why was the analogy of war picked? Because it's a very sensitive word, right? War. Because the military has developed the DNA of responding to a specific enemy, to defeat it, to stop it in its tracks. A very focused group of engagement and communication to do this. And so drawing on this, really, this article touches on 7 approaches. And the first approach is drawing on the framework above, is piercing the so-called fog of war. How do you pierce the fog of war? And that comes from the thinking of General Clausewitz, Prussian general, who wrote a famous book on war. And in it, he talks about the so-called fog of war, that in a crisis, in a battle, oftentimes your strategy is as good as the first bullet that's fired. Mike Tyson famously said, your strategy and approach is good as the first punch that lands on your face, and then everything falls apart. And in many ways, a lot of us are faced when we were first hit with this as the deer in the headlight syndrome. What's the plan? If you're in an organization that's particularly hierarchical and suddenly people are distributed, they're waiting for instructions and orders. What do we do? Should we do something? And so Clausewitz had a light approach, a light framework in which people were able to adapt. And this is quite important. Napoleon famously realized this and to his troops said, wherever there's gunfire, in the absence of orders, head there. And so in this place, we call that swarming in the agile world. Go where the help is needed. In this sense, the first thing is to pierce the fog of war as a leadership team, to create a really easy to understand set of principles for teams that are working in a distributed basis of what it is that they were able to do. The second principle was this principle of quick wins, making sure you get quick wins with a longer term strategy. And there the article refers to Miyamoto Mashushi, who's one of the great samurai, who his innovation in the time was the use of 2 swords in battle, a long sword and a short sword. And in summary, bringing back these military analogies, these agile analogies to this current battle we are facing, it's the short sword for quick wins and a long sword for long term. And because of this, in his time, this was one of the leaders that was absolutely undefeated in battle. This ability to think, how am I going to implement a quick win together with this? And as we go through these phases, and in many ways, we are in different chapters of this in different parts of the world. Chapter 1 was understanding the onslaught of this invisible enemy, where it first hit countries. And some countries are moving to chapter 2, which is thinking of the economic recovery. Some countries are on that, others are starting. And there's going to be chapter 3 and chapter 4 and chapter 5 and phase 1, 3, 4, and 5. And we have to respond in real time to each of these. What's common in all of this is this ability to respond, thinking short-term and long-term. And that brings us to the third element, which is the OODA loop. The OODA loop, observe, orientate, decide, and act, was brought to the fore, and again is a foundation principle taught in many agile programs by Colonel John Boyd, US Air Force, who realized, particularly in a time of war, where he had planes that were less advanced than the enemy's planes, where he realized that how are you able to defeat an enemy that may seem a step ahead, that may have more advanced equipment. In many ways, many managers are frustrated now that just when you think you understand the so-called growth curve is flattening, there is a change. And part of what Boyd's contribution was that the decision process is as important as the decision itself. That volatile world is not something to shy away from, is to accept it. But in your decision process, that becomes your competitive advantage. And so for him, he implemented an iterative OODA loop that in every encounter, in multiple times as you flew by, observe, orientate, decide, act. And he drilled that into his teams, and they were able to win multiple encounters. So how are you implementing that OODA loop? Now that could be in different forms. It's that pulse of your organization. Again, speaking in my personal capacity with incredible leadership, I'm part of it, working alongside some remarkable colleagues, that the communication we have is that every day at a certain time between 3 and 4 is a team-wide email to all of the team that we work with from our leadership. And we know that there's certainty every day, there's communication at that point in time. There's either new information or sometimes it says nothing to update, but that type of leadership of creating that pulse, that rhythm is absolutely the gold standard. It removes that uncertainty, it connects people, and it puts them into a rhythm. Cross-functional teams. Again, in this article, we talk about the work of Stan McChrystal, great general who came up with the concept of team of teams, a realization that hierarchical organizations were not getting him the information in the field. His famous example was if you find a laptop on the field and you needed it decoded, the old days it had to go onto a Hercules aircraft back into headquarters. It's a week, 2 weeks, that information would return. And by the time that happens, it's no longer relevant. The data is irrelevant. Others have either moved or that camp has moved. The intelligence is dated. Think about that in terms of our customer engagement, that oftentimes a competitor launches something, and as you develop your new app, as it's released several months later, it's outdated in its very release. How do you shorten that? And so from Crystal, it's the team of teams, of having a minimal viable team with the skills to decode and address situations. I'm going to go through the others very quickly. I talk about the glide path. Jeff Sutherland, one of the co-creators of Scrum, one of the most widely used frameworks within the Agile world, very much involved with Scrum at scale, pioneer in the Agile community, often talks about the glide path of a plane landing on an aircraft carrier in heaving waters. And the reason to adjust very fast the so-called angle in real time. And so how do teams adjust their glide path of landing a project? You break it into mini milestones so that by the time you approach, you have adjusted to be just right as opposed to waiting long periods of time. This glide path is very important again in our Agile training. And last but not least, as I come to the last two, we talk about the Stockdale paradox as well, where James Stockdale spoke that in any crisis, you have to balance this ability of being absolutely honest and upfront with what are the circumstances, the incredible challenge that is ahead. Realism balanced with optimism. And Stockdale learned that in prisoner of war camp. Again, this analogy of us going into battle, drawing on Agile lessons, that those that were the most optimistic, that believed that this was going to end by a period time X, so they were going to be released by Christmas or New Year's, were often the ones that struggled the most. I believe that success is you understand the challenge that we're all facing, but at the same time, also understand the path ahead. And so many leaders do this. I mentioned Ray Dalio in terms of some of the management lessons of radical transparency, of really showing what it is that people are faced with. And part of that transparency is that communication and making things visible. I'll come to that. And last but not least is the very term VUCA that we used, volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous. How do we think through those? And if we look at that, and I put this up, the so-called VUCA, that came from the War College, the so-called unknown unknowns, very much the world we are in to some degree, certainly how I'm experiencing it on a day-to-day basis. And how do you move from that to understanding that it isn't about having the perfect plan? In fact, it's almost impossible to have a plan today to say, in that so-called waterfall structured way, to say, this is the plan we're going to be following for the next year. It's the new way of being able to adapt and respond. And so it's being comfortable in the so-called VUCA world and moving to what, again, in the article I describe as VUCAgility, right? From being afraid of volatility to combating that by making communication visible and the engagement visible and increasing the pace of that. From this uncertain world to making that pace unrelenting and iterative, increasing that pain, that nurturing, empathetic, but very focused communication to our staff and teams. To looking at things as being hyper complex, which they are, okay? We have supply chains disrupted, human resources disrupted, airports, communication lines, all of this is interrupted. But at the end of it, our concentrated action of breaking those down will certainly put us on the path, because make no mistake, this is a battle that we will win. How we respond, though, will impact the runway in terms of the strength of that bounce back and how it's bounced back. And finally, from the ambiguous nature to focusing on the so-called action or the right action. And so I want to conclude with all of this talk of us winning this war against COVID and drawing on agile lessons, learning together and seeing where it's relevant, that we also have to think about peace. And when the world will return to the new normal, because we all would have adapted, to the words of Nobel Peace Prize laureate Archbishop Desmond Tutu, that a time of crisis is not just a time of anxiety and worry. It gives a chance, an opportunity to choose well or choose badly. And hopefully, certainly, our approach, and again, speaking in a personal capacity, the approach when we were fortunate enough to gather with leaders in January, for an incredible program, the kickoff of an agile, short, intensive program, that approach was learning from one another, not being dogmatic about the particular approach, but what are these themes that we can draw upon that can help and be of help, to folks as we all move into the so-called suddenly agile, suddenly distributed world. And so that's a broad run. And again, no presentation will do justice. There's so many themes. I'm very much looking forward to the next part of this discussion and engaging you, Carol, and also getting to questions.
Thanks so much, Euvin. I almost got so engaged in what you had to say, I was worried that I was going to forget to pop back in. So thank you very much. Very enlightening. So Euvin, one question that I feel is very, very important, and I'd love to ask you first, if you don't mind, is that because you are a faculty of the Harvard Business School, I would love to hear through your lens how you are seeing this crisis.
Oh, that's a great question, Carol. Thank you so much. Let me share very quickly on that question. How would you look at this through a typical MBA program, very much, or the general manager's program? Graduated 20 years ago from the Harvard Business School with an MBA, and now as part of that, and very much the approach is the general management approach. So if you look at it from the components of that, which is accounting, I sit within the accounting team, there's the finance department, there's the operations department, there's Biggie, really this belief in general managers. Very quickly, from the accounting perspective, one great analogy is that if you look at the world and your organization through a balance sheet, you have your assets and you have your liabilities. And very much in the world we are in today, on the asset side, this element of cash becomes important. Cash flow is important. Working capital is important. On the left-hand side of the balance sheet, we have our assets, we have our cash. And people are in this element of how do you conserve cash? How do you survive? How do you work through your working capital? And certainly on the liability side, you have loans. But I want to switch this classic asset and liability and talk about the balance sheet in terms of what we have faced. The liability side is very much the challenges of COVID-19. Disillusioned teams, deer in the headlights. We are frozen, inertia. And what are our assets? And this is the agile mindset. Our agile community talks about the assets. It's our people, the talent that is in there. And so change this view of assets and liabilities into the two types of balance sheets, the financial balance sheet and the so-called human balance sheet, and make sure that in this crisis, the asset side is being given every chance to shine and to blossom. Very quickly on the other points in finance, we talk about the so-called alpha and the beta. Alpha, which is absolute return, beta is house stocks. People need to think about alpha and beta in those minds. In terms of free cash flows are discounted cash flows, future cash flows over a discounted rate. And so free cash flow over discounted rate, very much what we're seeing unfolding is a view that on the numerator, organizations, companies, governments are faced with a challenge of saying, what does that future hold? That discount rate in the denominator is about risk, and you've got to think through both those elements. And so in the US, as an example, the stimulus is very much about putting cash flow into the right hands and helping, but also getting a runway so that the discount rate has a chance of recovering and is not too high. And so these are the mindsets of thinking about it. And final points is that supply chain is impacted in the logistics world. Local logistics are becoming more important. And last but not least, if you're a country, is your financing in dollar-based or in local currency or corporation? If it's in hard currency, you've got new challenges. Do you have a long-term financing for short-term needs? Do you have short-term financing for long-term needs? All of this comes into play. And so we very much aim to look at the MBA lens of saying, do you have the depth and the breadth to pull all of this together? So thanks for that.
Great, thank you. That is kind of a nice segue into one of the questions that we received. And basically it's just, is this really the time to transform the way that we work? So many managers and people are saying, we're too busy, our income stream has just dried up. What would you tell them?
It's a fantastic question, right? You're changing the tire of the moving vehicle while there's also all of this happening around. Here's my interpretation. We have changed. It's not should we change while this is taking place. It has happened to all of us. And let me explain that. If you are, whether you're in an entrepreneurial venture, a small, medium enterprise, or a large corporation, we are all, most of us, working from distributed teams, be it in our homes, be it in other offices. We do have to respond faster than traditional ways previously. We all suddenly have to become online experts. It's affected our children in schools, online classes. Whatever was taking place in the world in many ways has been accelerated either for the positive or the negatives. And so to that, the approach is not so much, do we have to change? We are changing. What the lessons from agility provide is a framework to say, what can we draw upon in the sense of not being afraid of this change, but almost embracing it. So the decision process mechanism we put in place is as important as the decision. And the main thing is to say that it is really tough and it's going to be really tough.
So I think along with that, it's about that preparedness for knowing that there's now something always on the forefront, right? So I remember when I used to work in the banking industry and I was in disaster recovery, and we actually had buildings that were ready for the next disaster so that we could get ready in just 10 minutes. We could be over into another data center if we had to be. I'm dating myself, I know, but I think it's important that, I've heard people say we have to be able to outsmart ourselves and be prepared for that next time. Let's not wait for it. So I think that's so important.
And so to unpack that, the question is, you're not going to be launching a formal transformation program. Yeah. This is not the time. Lives first, team first. This is the moment for leaders to really support people. The servant leadership model comes to the fore. However, there are people in our teams that are not used to this new structure of either working alone or isolated. So one of the examples that you can draw upon from lessons Agile community is, are you pairing people together so that every day someone has a so-called partner or someone to pair with that they can check in? Do you have a 15-minute daily stand-up that could be virtual, that is not about reporting back, but people get to understand what are the bottlenecks that you are facing? So you're not running a transformation project. You are putting in some of these lessons or tools that provide the fabric for humans to connect, have a support network, and be able to accelerate and feel that they're making a contribution.
Fantastic. So you just answered, I think, another question that was very asked a couple of times throughout the Q&A questions that I kind of bundled them together and said, what specific approaches can we take to change an essentially hierarchical organization to adopt Agile thinking?
I think absolutely fantastic question that's at the heart of so many things. Because everyone is at a different phase. And the first thing I would say is, forget the language, forget the word agile, forget all of it. what are the principles that we are talking about, right? And if we come to, for example, the Scrum at Scale model, which is a great contribution to help people accelerate their thinking. And again, we're model agnostic, right? The real interesting thing about this particular model or other agile models is it has a strategic approach and an operational approach. So at the strategic basis, if there's a leadership team, has the leadership team, as an example, convened what we call their emergency or crisis team? How often are they gathering? There's a recent interview on television where the leaders of one of the large hotels was sharing his cycle. And he said, I used to have a monthly meeting with my direct reports. It's moved to weekly, and now it's moved twice a week. Many leaders, and you find the rhythm, are on 15-minute check-in. How can you debottleneck? That's the first thing. The second thing is the leadership team got what we call a clear set of priorities? And they are going to change all the time and literally have them visible that this is priority one, safety first, our people first. How are we supporting customers? How are we getting our supply chains right? We've got to keep the company healthy, the runway in terms of our cash flow and survival. Can we keep as many people employed? That backlog becomes prioritized, visible. Does the team have that? Is that communicated to the distributed teams? Within the distributed teams, even if you have that hierarchical culture, now's the time to set these small examples to say, what ideas do people have? You know, here's a set of guiding principles. How can we work together? There is no set answer. This isn't about implementing transformation. It is about providing human support tools to get things over the line in this time of change. And the agile world has some of these, you know, to draw upon. And so my question is, don't call it the 15-minute daily stand-up, but the principles become important. And let me just talk about those principles very quickly. The first principle is that some of these meetings shouldn't be about the actual problem solving. It really is about a check-in for leaders to say, how can I debottleneck? The second is, you know, what's the right size of a team? There's always been these anecdotes research-wise that a team of 4 to 9 is really amazing, with 4 to 6, even 5 being the ideal number. And so if you're a leader, think through, again, there's no right or wrong answer, but some of the research shows that once a team gets too big, it becomes very cumbersome to make decisions. So your core 5, core 6, whatever that number you decide, how are you able to meet as a group, get a prioritized set of outcomes and focus areas, and really share that, and as a collective get that going. And whether you're in McChrystal's so-called command and control, where he moved all the way down to team and teams, it doesn't matter at this point in time. We have a common human need to come together, to be focused. Everybody wants to see how they can help, I believe. And leadership really is, in times of crisis, helping people break out of that inertia, break out of the fear. It's okay to be afraid. This is challenging times for folks, but creating that runway or that path.
Great, thank you. So in the command and control world, leaders have created the expectation of their teams, kind of the do as I say model. And now, if they're going to move to this more agile mindset, how do they start to build that trust with their teams? Like, wait a minute, they're asking for my opinion. They're asking how I can, you know, what they can do to help me. How do we build that trust, and how do we make sure that we don't lose momentum? Because we all know that it's easy to fall back. We know it's the right thing to do, but it's easy to fall back. So how do we continue to build that trust and gain more collaboration between team and leaders?
That is the ultimate question. I've often used this word agile mindset. What does that mean? In many of the programs that have taken place in some of the organizations that have done the really tough task of doing it, is that this really is about a cultural change. It's a mindset shift of really empowering employees. This is a difficult time to even start talking about transformation. So regardless of where you are in the spectrum, we give up the language, but it really is about action. And what is it that leaders, regardless of the type of org design that they have, call it what you want. What is it that they're doing to really help teams that are all now suddenly distributed? And part of it is your listening mechanism. It can be your town hall, all hands on deck, the ability to provide feedback or structure. Because agility is all about providing a loose framework, but part of that is culture. Why the challenge is so great is that cultural change is the most difficult change to implement in any organization. Easily said, the most difficult thing to do, right? I believe that as a result of this, organizations do realize, regardless of their structure, even those that have agile programs, this is not easy for anybody. You know, to the quote, unprecedented waters for everyone, is that we all have transformed. There is a recognition of decreasing the response time. And the way leaders can do that is tried and tested. I'm not going to, I'm going to draw on the great work that's been done on cultural transformation is by doing. That what is the tone that you are setting in this moment? How we act in this moment in time, this pivotal moment, is a sign of leadership. Are you there for your people? Are you listening? Are you able to respond to the best of your ability under these circumstances, right? Are you over-promising? Do not over-promise. That Stockdale paradox, being honest with your people, but providing that feedback. And so it's by doing. Are you genuinely listening, right? And it starts by that. The servant leadership model of understanding that you have to depend on your distributed teams if you're in an organization now to exist. And how are you helping them self-organize? This mindset of waiting for instructions to unlocking that ability and innovation to contribute. And that's it. And some are going to step up to that in your organization and some are not. And so part of it is helping different people on the journey. It is okay. Some may not be able to, and that's okay. We have to support that. Some are able to enter. How do you accelerate it? Some are thriving and shining in this environment because that's what they're built for. Perhaps that's the journey they've come from. How can that help others come along? But wherever you are in that, it is those signals you are sending as a leadership team of being able to do that. And ultimately, it's also about small wins, those incremental successes that you have. Now, some of those successes may be about securing that line of credit, getting that supplier right, but some of them are organizational, psychological, but also human. Are you able to, for example, support a team member in need because you have a communication network that helps them? Have you allowed your teams to self-organize and support one another, all in the hope of sorting out your priority and prioritized list? I'm not trying to oversimplify things. This is tough. This is tough stuff, right? And that's why, in many ways, a lot of the agile world, which again, the context matters. You got to draw on it based on your own context. It helps because it deals on muscle memory. And what's muscle memory about? You know, there are many sports that train you on muscle memory that increases your reflexes. All it does is that when you're hit with a crisis, it allows you to be able to respond better. And without judgment, everyone is at a different point in that. Some of it may be structural because of sector and circumstances and resources. I grew up in an emerging market. The response and the ability for different places to respond is different. This is respecting and recognizing that. But based on your context, how do you set yourself up for the best possible success with really challenging circumstances, knowing it's not easy, with just the deepest respect for that context.
Great, thank you. So we have about 5 minutes left. I'm going to ask one more question because it's a great segue into what you're just talking about, and then we'll wrap it up from there. So really, you talked about iterative, and you also, in the beginning of the conversation, you talked about those businesses and organizations that are very large today, but they were kind of born agile, if you would. But not everybody is, and not everybody has taken on that transformation yet. And some people might think that transformation means, wow, if I decide to do a transformation, I have to go big bang, and how do I do that? And it's really not about that, right? It's about the iterative decision to become more agile. How do you suggest where to start? Because some people do start at different places, some at the team level, some at the executive action team, some where, how do you suggest people start?
It's a great question. Starting is often the most difficult element. And I think the first step is be kind to yourself. Whether you're a leader in an organization, whether you're a team leader, whether you're a member of a team delivering a specific project, be kind to yourself. Your first priority is make sure you are healthy. You are taking care of it. Because if you're in this position, be it with a family, be it with a company where others are depending on you and you are depending on yourself, if you don't get that right, the system fails. The second is, if we go back to our Agile principles, it is about working through what personally for you is your clear backlog, as we call it. What are your set of priorities? Your must-do elements. Safety first. How do we live up to that? Creating a runway of safety so for our organization can survive. All of that is very particular. If you're a country, a clearly communicated plan that is able to get to various stakeholders. So create that clear set of priorities that as much as possible can be moving and shifting, but you've articulated what are the must-haves. And next, understand what your operating rhythm is of how you're going to do that. I think the other element, and that's the operational bit. The strategic bit is being realistic in terms of knowing that this is going to be tough in every sector and that we are in the new normal and it's going to continue to be tough. And in that environment, as best as possible, what is your spirit of resilience to be able to step up because others are depending on you. And last but not least is you are not in this alone, is to draw on your team members. And so that's my first question to folks, is that do they have a set of priority that they said, this is my true north, I am going to stick to it. And then making that visible. So I go back to VUCA to VUCAgility, right? And really, focus on that in terms of making it, really visible and really, adaptable.
Fantastic. With that, we're kind of, there are some questions that we weren't able to get to, but hopefully we've answered most of them. And I want to thank you so much, Euvin, for sharing your knowledge and wisdom with us today. Before I wrap this up, do you have any last words?
Well, first of all, wonderful to be, on this platform sharing personal thoughts, but just some closing comments. There is no panacea. No approach solves all problems. There are just a set of principles that can enable us to draw on based on our context. And so I'd encourage everyone to do that. But also, just in the spirit of say how grateful I have been to the Agile community, to be a part of it, of how much we're all learning together, but how important that community is at this moment in time. A lot of people in the Agile community have said, we've been talking about this need to build muscle memory for DNA change. This is not a moment for us to say, I told you so, and no one is saying that, but share the knowledge, learn together, but make sure that whatever we discuss fits your context. And last but not least is, sincerely wish that some of these points ring true and can make value. To the Agile community, true servant leaders, please continue the work. And I very much look forward to continuing to learn from everyone and exchanging ideas.
Thank you so much. And thank you to all the attendees who were able to join us today. The recording of today's presentation will be available on the website within the next 24 hours. And if you'd like to stay connected with our community, you can subscribe to our newsletter and learn more about us at scrumattscale.com. So thanks everybody. Thanks Euvin, and make it a great day. Bye for now.